Okay, let's go ahead and get started this morning. We've got a lot of ground to cover, as we always do. We are at chapter 20 of the book of Revelation today. We're coming very, very close to the end of our study of Revelation that I have enjoyed immensely, and I hope it's been beneficial to each and every one of us. This chapter is, in the words of a preeminent theologian and scholar named Dr. G.B. Caird. He was a theologian at Oxford University, ran that department of theology for years, has a tremendous book on Revelation, which I think he does a great job of correctly interpreting Revelation. But Dr. Caird he used the word, said this is an intriguing chapter where there's a lot of controversy, even among scholars that generally agree with this. So we're going to try to use our formula for correctly interpreting Revelation. Do you remember we talked about there are several integral factors that we've got to always keep in mind? Number one, we've always got to keep in mind, first and foremost, the audience to whom Revelation was addressed. That John delivered the message from God to a certain group of people. Now, that's not to say it's not relevant to us, because everything in there is relevant to us. Pardon me. But to understand Revelation, we've got to say, what was the message? How did they understand it? And that audience was whom? First century Christians in the Roman Empire, and they were undergoing intense persecution. Secondly, we said, what else do we have to understand before we really understand what Revelation is saying? You've got to understand the genre, the type of literature that is written, and we said it was apocalyptic. Pardon me. And we said that this audience fully understood this style of writing, this genre of writing. Why did they understand it? Very, very common for about four and a half centuries. It was probably the most popular form of literature. And what characterized apocalyptic literature? Very good. Symbolism. Well, it's early. I mean, after a holiday, it's early. Symbolism. We used a lot of examples of things, symbolism that we use that a lot of people wouldn't understand. I dare say all the people that are here in the Metroplex from Europe right now, around the world, they don't understand raining cats and dogs. They don't understand a whole lot of different things that we take for granted. And we've got to understand, what did that mean to those people so that we can take the meaning and bring it into our understanding. Thirdly, what else do we say that was so important? Oh, that's the message. Very good. You're going to win. I'm sorry. Okay, and that was the thesis, if you will, the focus of Revelation. But we've got to understand Old Testament prophecy, because we have gone back and we have looked at old prophecy after prophecy after prophecy from the Old Testament, and a lot of that prophecy was written in symbolism back then. And I hope that each of us have seen very clearly that when we see what the prophecy was in the Old Testament, centuries and centuries before this was written, then it makes a lot more sense to us. And Dr. Caird, to whom I referred a moment ago, he wrote a great book on Revelation. I left it for the preacher that came in after I did, so he didn't feel comfortable with Revelation. I said, well, just take this book and read it. So if you ever want to look at a pretty good book on Revelation, Dr. G.B. Caird, this is The Revelation of St. John the Divine is the name of the book. And it's a pretty good book. But Dr. Caird said that, and I'll quote him as near verbatim as I possibly can. He said, chapter 20 is, quote, the happy hunting grounds of all kinds of religious eccentrics. What does that mean? Yeah, it's a plethora of interpretations. They're based on their thoughts, not on the thoughts of what we've been trying to use as a basis for understanding Revelation. So kind of keep that in mind as you go through here. And there's even some things that, I'll be real honest with, to me, a little bit foggy. But we're going to try to use this process that we have used all the way through. And let's just kind of have an overview of chapter 20 before we get into it. There are three, you want to call them scenes, scenarios, whatever, three things that John sees here in this chapter. And folks, we've already talked about each one of them. But he presents it like we have so often seen in Revelation from a different perspective. The scholars like to call this overlapping. They overlap. A whole lot of what we looked at in chapter 19, we're going to see again in chapter 20. And the mistake that a lot of people make, apocalyptic literature in general, and Revelation is no exception, it's not always chronological. What happened here didn't necessarily happen before this or after this. And so these three scenes or these three messages you'll be familiar with. The first thing he's going to talk about is what is generally referred to, and in the exact text, the binding of Satan. What do you think that again, highly symbolic the way he does it, the binding of Satan. Very good. God is in control, and we're going to see that Satan loses his power. Now, we all know this, but before we get into the text and this symbolic language, when was the ultimate doom of Satan's power? When did Satan lose in all finality? Very good. His death, his burial, and his resurrection. You know, if I ask you, what is Satan's greatest tool? His greatest threat to mankind? Yeah, deceit. And he wants to tell us that death is the end. Physical death is the end. And you think about when Christ died on the cross, we know Satan rejoiced. We know the Roman Empire rejoiced. We're through with him. He's gone. 3 days later, what happened? He came back. In fact, let's just turn back real quick. Turn back to the 12th chapter. We've already seen this. The 12th chapter of Revelation. And if you look at verse 11, he's talking about a group of martyrs that we're going to see more of in this chapter. Chapter 12, verse 11. And they, referring to the saints that had been faithful even unto death, and they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the words of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. Satan feels like that death is the ultimate defeat for God, and for God. That was proved wrong at the cross of Calvary. That was proved wrong 3 days later when he was resurrected. And it's going to prove wrong. We won't take time to go back. But Romans 6 chapter says, we have been what with Christ? Raised, buried with Christ, and then raised with Christ. And the message is very plain. Satan's not going to defeat you by physical death. You know, as I've often said in memorial services, physical death is not the end for the Christian. Literally speaking, it is the what? It's the beginning for a child of God, the beginning of an eternity with the Lord. And we see this same thing here. And so we're going to see, number one, that Satan is going to be, and we'll talk a little bit more historically about this and prophecy-wise, Satan's going to be bound. He's going to be defeated. But the second vision that he's going to see here is what is sometimes called the loosing of Satan. Lots of far-out ideas about this. But it's very simple. Satan has already been defeated, but what? He's still got lots of power, and he's still a great threat. And unless we hold on to the truth and hold on to Christ, he's dangerous. 1 Peter 5th chapter verse 8, be watchful, be sober, your adversary prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Wake up, Peter was saying to those first century Christians. Wake up, that's what he's saying here. Satan's still out there, he's still prowling, and he's going to be here. We read just a moment ago in verse 12 of that 12th chapter. He knows he only has a, quote, short time. And he won't quit until the ultimate defeat that he has. And we'll look at, again, a whole lot of symbolism here when we get into that second scene. The third scene is judgment. Judgment. And at that point, what is going to ultimately happen to Satan and to evil and to those who are, to use the symbolism, marked by the beast? It's over. There's going to be a time, like we talked before, we see that third scene, when evil and Satan and anti-godly things are done away with forever, for all eternity. And we're going to see also that, particularly in that second vision, that all this time, as people are waiting on the Lord's coming and judgment, that God's people are taken care of. They're all taken care of. So it's just like the rest of Revelation, a very, very upbeat, positive concept. But a lot of people, like I say, have a lot of very erroneous, sadly, I hope and pray it's not intentional, but there's just a lot of ideas that just don't hold water if you get right down to it. So let's go ahead and start in verse 1. I hope to finish chapter 20. I don't know that we will because there's so much here. Verse 1 of chapter 20. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven. So we know immediately what is this scene that John's going to see. Who's in control? God is. God's messenger is coming with this scene, this revelation, this unveiling that has been prevalent all the way through. He's coming down from heaven, and he's got two things that he got. Number one, he has a key. What's a key? It opens. It's pretty much the control, isn't it? I mean, if I want to get my house, I have a key. I have the ability to open it. I also have the ability to lock it. So he's got a key, and the key goes to, what's your translation say here? The abyss. Now, there's several synonyms here for abyss in Revelation that we've looked at. Can you tell me something else that this location, the abyss, what is it in the first place? It's the place of all evil. You remember what else we see back in Revelation earlier? What was the source of evil? The sea. Very good. The sea, the abyss, sometimes called the bottomless pit. But it is the place of evil, where evil precipitates itself upon the world. And so we see that he's got the key to the abyss, key to the bottomless pit, the key to hell. What's that tell you? God's in total control. Even of this, and we've talked about it all the way through, we've seen this in Revelation, that God allows evil to help accomplish his purpose. And so we see that he is in total control. These folks are having a hard time believing that. Why? They're persecuted. They're hurting. They are hurting. But then if you look, he also had something else. What did he have? A chain. Now this carries special significance to these first century Christians and first century residents of the Roman Empire, because the Romans, they were of course conquering all over the then known world, and they had a ritual, I guess you could say, a celebration, a victory parade called a triumph. Every time they conquered something else, the conquering general or the conquering man in charge, sometimes the emperor himself, they had a parade through the city of Rome called a triumph. Anybody know what that was? Yeah, he came in as a conquering hero, or in the case of the emperor, a deity, the emperor cult that we've talked about many times. And they came in, and the ritual was that they would bring in sometimes thousands of captives, slaves, and they were all chained together. And they would march them through the streets of Rome, chained up. Generally, the conqueror, sometimes the emperor, sometimes the military commander, would ride behind them in a chariot. And The whole message was what? Power. He's in control. Now, we're going to see it's not conquered people that are chained up in this vision. But we're going to see in verse 2 who it is. And he laid hold of the dragon. And we don't have to guess who the dragon is here, because he just flat tells us right here. The dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him. He bound him. So in your mind, when they're talking about this, they're seeing a triumph. And they see these Roman emperors coming in, or the Roman military commanders riding in with all of these people chained up, bound, under their control. And now, in this vision, this symbolism, who's bound up and under control? Satan is in this. And then he says something that has completely confounded a lot of people for many, many years. For 1,000 years. Now, I want to remind you something. We're going to get into this pretty much in depth. I started just kind of skip this to avoid confusion, but I would be remiss if I did, because there is so much misinterpretation about this phrase, 1,000 years. But before we get into it, I want to remind you, we have seen numbers throughout Revelation. 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days, 10 days. Every time we see a number, I've warned us, what do we need to do? Understand it's not literal, it is symbolic. And throughout, and we're going to see this, throughout apocalyptic literature, not just Revelation, but throughout apocalyptic literature, like First Enoch, the Sibylline oracles, the book of Baruch, you can go on and on and on. There were a whole lot of these apocalyptic works, both what we'd call religious and non-religious, secular, spiritual. I mean, they had all these different works, and they all used this apocalyptic literature. And we're going to see some of this in just a minute. But every time you see a number, have a red flag waving, saying, hey, listen, what does this mean? You know, it's just like, I've told you before, if I talk about the number 13 in our society, what comes to your mind? Bad luck. There's nothing, doesn't have anything to do with 13, but we think of bad luck. And so when they saw these numbers, remember we talked about there was a number 666, and we said what was the significance of that several chapters ago? That's exactly right. That was the Greek number. Letters were assigned numbers. And his name, the name of Nero, was 666. So they immediately, when they're talking about that, they're talking about this infamous Roman emperor. Same thing right here. But many of you probably, if you've had any exposure to Revelation at all, have probably been familiar with the word the millennium. The millennium. What does millennium mean? 1,000. It is a Latin word for 1,000. Not all. It doesn't just have to be related to years, but it was a Latin word for 1,000. And I just want to read. I have a little article here. I just want to read this. This summarizes it more succinctly and really better than I possibly could. The 1,000 years are often referred to as the millennium, Latin for 1,000. It says the three major positions of this issue are called, anybody know what they are? Yeah, postmillennialism, premillennialism, and amillennialism. We're going to look at all three of these just very, very briefly. Again, I don't want to confuse anybody, but I feel like I would be wrong if I didn't share it with you, because you're going to have people throw this at you if you're ever describing or discussing the book of Revelation. Postmillennialism looks for a literal 1,000-year period of peace on earth ushered in by the church. Okay, first thing, when we see that word literal, what should we do? Probably not, because we know the nature of apocalyptic. And then when we see ushered in by the church, when did the church begin? after Christ rose from the dead, typically we say AD 33, AD 29. There's going to be 1,000 years of absolute peace after that, according to the post-millennialists. Is it all peace right now? and so we look at that. He goes on and says, at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be unleashed once more, but then Christ will return to defeat him and reign forever. Christ's second coming will not occur until after the 1,000-year period. Okay, then here is premillennialism. Premillennialism, that's kind of hard to say. I feel like I have a mouthful of L's there. Premillennialism also views 1,000 years as a literal time period, but holds that Christ's second coming initiates his 1,000-year reign, and that this reign occurs before the final removal of Satan. So you're going to have Christ come the second time, then you're going to have 1,000 years of peace and conflict, and then Satan's going to be finally defeated, and that's the only problem with, well, not the only problem, but one of the major problems with premillennialism is what? I'm sorry? Well, that's very, and that's something, I'm glad you pointed that out. A lot of times people get so caught up in the when instead of the what in Revelation. And the what is, as Bert said a minute ago, and several of you have echoed it, the what is, hey, Christians, you're going to win. God's going to win. And you're going to be at peace with the Lord throughout your existence, throughout the fold. And then the amillennialism, the third one, understands the 1,000-year period to be symbolic of the time between Christ's ascension. When did Christ ascend? 3 days after his death. Between Christ's ascension and his return, the millennium is the reign of Christ in the hearts of the believers and the church. That is another way of referring to the church age, which a lot of people would say was a part of the Messianic age. This period will end with the second coming of Christ. Now, just quite frank, that's the view I hold to. That there is, I like the way that Paul put it in Philippians, the 4th chapter. There's a peace that what? Passes all understanding. And that's where I see this. There's this peace for these folks. Now, we just said that the second view is that Satan's going to be loosed. He's still going to be on the rampage, but there's still going to be a peace. And when Christ comes that second time, that's the end. And we see that third view of judgment that we'll get into. So any questions before we go on anymore? Okay, I think we're all good right now. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until 1,000 years were complete. And those things and after these things, he must be released for a short time. We've already seen that back in Revelation, the 12th chapter, verse 9. We've already seen that. Now, when you see that word, complete, that was in that verse right there a moment ago, I would urge every one of us to think about that being a synonym to this 1,000 years. Because in apocalyptic literature, in the book First Enoch, and in what we've talked about another one called the Sibylline Oracles, they talked about a struggle where Satan is bound and Satan is incarcerated basically for 1,000 years. The 1,000 years, not just in these two religious works, and not just in Revelation, but in so much of the apocalyptic literature, this 1,000 years represented a completeness, a fulfillment of God's plan. And we see it all the way through. We see it through chapter 20 here, but we also see it in all this other apocalyptic literature. The 1,000 years, God has a plan. Satan's loose, but God's still in control, and there's going to be a time when Satan is completely destroyed. And so it says here that he's going to be, he still has power. Satan still has power today. You know, we talked about the fact that both the post and the premillennialists will say, well, there's total peace for child. We know that's not right. We know that we struggle. We know, like I quoted 1 Peter the 5th chapter, verse 8, wake up, be watchful, be sober. Your adversary the devil prowls about like a roaring lion. We know he's out there. And we know we better be vigilant and be aware because he still has power. But what we saw in that first vision, guess what? We win and he loses. And he knows he's going to lose. But he wants to take as many people with him in a scene that we'll see in just a minute as possible. So we look at that. We see that basically everything we're talking about right now, we've already seen. We're just looking at it in a little different way. Then I saw, verse 4, on the throne, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. Who do you think he's talking about? Who's sitting on the throne in this vision? God, and who else? His people. People, they are in the presence. These are martyrs that we've talked about all the way through. The people that are suffering and dying, the people to whom Jesus spoke in Revelation 2:10, be faithful even unto death, and I will give you what? A crown of life. Now, when we get to the end of this picture, all these people that have been faithful even unto death, where are they? The presence of whom? God. They're at peace. That's where the peace comes in. They're at peace. And you know something? There's a debate among scholars. I definitely think first and foremost he's talking about the martyrs. But you know who else I think he's talking about? All of God's people. I mean, and this is a rhetorical question because I think I know the answer to it. Have you ever felt just in a devastating position and suddenly you felt peace? I mean, probably several of us in here have faced the possibility of a life-ending situation. And had I not been in that position, I would not have understood that peace that passes all understanding. But a peace when you get to thinking about our future, which is what he's pointing out to these Christians, death, Satan's trump card, is not so frightening. Because you know what? You're going to win. And that picture that he says, these people are in the presence of God. Now, judgment hadn't come yet. So technically speaking, until judgment comes, we're not going to be where? Heaven, right? But we are in the presence of God. You know, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, what's that called? Where Lazarus was. The bosom of Abraham, and some translations say paradise right there. So even though you hadn't had judgment and that final pronouncement of victory, you're at peace. On the other hand, those that don't belong to the Lord, that haven't been faithful to the Lord, what's their destination at this point? Torment. Yeah. The Greek and Latin term is Hades. Not hell, but Hades. A place of torment. We remember the story of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man, he's in agony. So there's already that separation, that we don't have the finality of judgment that we're about to see, and the total destruction of Satan and him being banished and totally bound, if you will. But we see that coming. Now he goes on here and he says, and I saw on the thrones, they sat on them, and the judgment was given them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded, which again gives us a good idea. We're talking about the martyrs, because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God. And those who had worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand. And they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Again, this time until God's plan is complete. Don't forget that 1,000 years talking about the completion, the finality, the fruition of God's plan. But they're still safe. They're still safe. They're still rewarded. They're still cared for. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. Wonder who he's talking about, the rest of the dead. I'm sorry? Us? Yeah. Some scholars say he's talking about everybody else, both the saints and those who are not God's people. Well, we already seen their separation here. We know that. But he's talking about the fact that those martyrs are rewarded and everybody else is waiting for God's plan to come to an end. Notice what he says. This is the first resurrection. There are two phrases or two terms here. There's the first death and the second death, and the first resurrection and the second resurrection. What do you think the first death is? We see that down here in just a minute. First death? Physical death. Very good, Jim. Physical death. Now let me ask you something. Who's going to experience physical death? Everybody. Everybody. Even if Christ returns while I'm still breathing, what happens to physical life with old Greg when Christ comes back? It's gone. So that concept of first death, everybody experiences it. Jim's term is very well taken. It is physical. Second death, just a second, Jim. I'll get you a microphone here. I'm very technological, by the way. I even know how to turn it on now.
The big thing you mentioned, that people, Lazarus and that thing, we're talking about that one is at peace and one is condemned. They have been cast into hell. And the reason, to me, as I sat here thinking about it, why one is so peaceful, because they in that, and I'm going to say spirited animation, that they know already where they are, so they have to rejoice in this because they know it. They know even though they are physically dead, they are in this realm that brings joy. The others haven't been cast into the everlasting darkness, but they know where they're going, and they have to be in agony. So you have these two already knowing their destiny.
Very good way to put it. Jeff's got you there. Very good way to put it. And that's the whole point. Everybody's going to experience the first death, physical death. What do you think the second death is? It's spiritual. Spiritual. And who's going to experience spiritual death? To use the phrase that the symbolism that he has here, those that have the mark of the beast, those that belong to Satan. And there's that clear-cut distinction that we have. First resurrection, he just talks about the first resurrection for the martyrs, certainly, but for all of God's people is what? The first resurrection he just talked about. What did he say? It's when we leave this physical life and we're in the presence of the Lord. You want to guess what the second resurrection is? When you stand before that judgment seat of God, and what words do you hear? Well done, good and faithful servant, because you've been faithful over a few matters, I'll make you Lord and Master over many, or King over many. Enter into the joys of your kingdom, into the joys of your reward, if you will. So we see here, we all know this, we all understand that when this physical life ends, there's a separation right there between God's people and those that aren't. And then we're going to see there's some finality. It's already said and done then, but there's some finality that we see in that third view. He goes on. Here's a word we've talked about the last several weeks. Blessed. Blessed. He used this to describe those that are experiencing that first resurrection. Blessed means what? I'm sorry? Ecstatic, yes. I'm sorry. Happy, yes, happy beyond measure, ecstatic, just a euphoria that, as we say, the Latin word that was used here, as well as the Greek phrase, had a concept that these people that resonate with them, you can't believe how powerful it's going to be. You ever tried to think about what heaven's going to be like? I can't wrap my head around it, but it sure does make me feel good. And I think that's what he's saying here. And holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death, okay, there that is, spiritual death, has no power. But they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. That 1,000 again is what? The completion, the fruition, the coming of fruition of God's plan. That's God. You know, ever since the Garden of Eden, what'd sin do in the Garden of Eden? Separated people from God. It always has. And there's not but one thing we just read back there in Revelation 12, 9, and 10. There's just one thing that brings us back into the presence of God. What's that? The blood of Christ. And because of that fact, we're promised, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of righteousness. And we see that picture here. We see that beautiful picture in this first scene. The second scene, when the 1,000 years are completed, in other words, when God's plan comes to fruition, to completion, Satan will be released from his prison when he'll come out and to try to deceive the nations. Remember back in Revelation 12:9, talks about he's the deceiver of the whole world. He's not going to quit until the end, which are in the four corners of the earth. And then he mentions a couple of places that really throw people for a loop. Gog and Magog. Now, we've seen Gog before, if we're Old Testament scholars. Back in Ezekiel, the 38th and 39th chapter, Ezekiel talks about Gog and the forces along with Gog coming to battle against God's people. That's back during the days of the Babylonians. What in the world could Ezekiel be talking about for this country that didn't even exist? There was no nation in history ever known as Gog. You may know. What was, I'll just tell you, symbolic. What was the symbolism back in Ezekiel 38 and 39, talking about Gog leading a force against God's people? All the nations, keep in mind, where are God's people? Where's the nation of Judah about to be? Remember to whom Ezekiel prophesied? He prophesied to the Jews, God's chosen people, as they call themselves. In Judah, they had become faithless. And he warns them, hey, you better wake up and you better come back to God. And they didn't. And what happened? What did God allow to happen to them? They all got taken off into Babylonian captivity. 3 different invasions, 605, 587, and 586. They came in and they basically wiped them out. They were all gone, taken away from their homes, taken away from what was left of their families. A lot of them were killed. And it was not just the Babylonians, but it's kind of like the Romans had done as well. They had all these allies that wanted to keep from being annihilated themselves. And so all these nations, Ezekiel 38 and 39, he talks about all these nations that have come against God's people. But these folks know what happened to this group generically called Gog as the years went by. We've already said we know what happened to the Babylonians. It happened to all their other allies too that were playing God's people. What happened to them? They didn't even exist anymore. They'd been wiped out. And then he mentions Magog. We do see the name Magog. Moses' son, I'm trying to think which son it was. I may have it written down here. Jephthah. He had a son named Magog. They had kind of drifted off. This is way back in Genesis. He kind of drifted off. and we don't have any more record of Magog or his descendants. So when he's talking about Gog and Magog, he said all these people will rise up against God's people, an overwhelming earthly force. But look what happens. To gather them together for a war, the number of them is like the sand on the seashore. What's that symbolism? What's that analogy? There's a whole bunch. They seem to be totally overwhelming. And then verse 9. And they came upon the broad plain of the earth, and they surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and devoured them. Even though, from human perspective, they can't be beat. And he's talking, now of course Babylon's long gone and all those nations are gone. But what he's talking about, and we can make application to us too, doesn't matter what kind of earthly force comes against us, if we're faithful to God, what's going to happen? We're going to be preserved. We're going to be victorious in the end. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they'll be tormented day and night for what? Forever and ever. Now you've got that scene right at the end of time. All these forces of evil, if you want to talk about that, all these forces of evil, they always have been in history, and they always will be ultimately defeated. And in the end, when God says time's over, Satan and all these sources of evil are going to be thrown into the abyss, if you will. Because who's got the key to the abyss? God is. We saw that in the very first verse. So the whole bottom line is, hey, just hang in there. Doesn't matter what you see. But look back in history and see that evil has always been destroyed. And ultimately, the source of evil, Satan, is going to be destroyed as well. Remember back in chapter 12, we saw that picture. He saw Satan thrown down from heaven and his angels. Well, this is their end right here. This is their end. Somebody say, when is that going to happen? I don't know. When God says it is. That's exactly. You know, I was reading just the other day. Somebody said, "Oh, Gog and Magog, that's the Russians, the communist Russians, and the communist Chinese." I have no doubt that evil empires, if you want to classify them as evil empires, I think you'd be well within your logic. They're going to be destroyed. But you know, this particular person, he was a premillennialist, says this is how the earth's going to end. That's not what it's saying. That's simply saying this big generic concept that we've talked about all along. God's in control. God's going to take evil. Stay with God, and you're going to win. And we can't lose sight of that fact. Oh, my goodness. Somebody keeps winding that clock the wrong direction, I'm convinced. We're going to have to stop there because it's 10:15. And we'll pick up with verses 11 through 15, Lord willing, next week. And then here's where we see judgment. You know, a whole lot of Revelation that we've seen already has reference to things that have already happened that are going to happen again. But again, it's not a timeline. Here, this talks about the ultimate judgment. And there's a whole lot of the Old Testament that we're going to go back and look at Old Testament prophecy that talks about this. And like I say, Lord we'll pick up there in verse 11 next week. I was hoping we could finish in 2 more weeks after this, but I don't know that we will. I kind of had the Carlin effect this morning. I had to get that in. I had to.
Good teacher makes him laugh.
He is a good teacher too, a great teacher. Thoroughly enjoy his classes. Okay, we're going to stop there and pick up next week. Thank y'all very, very much for being here.